I can recognize that plant now as a Parkdale plant because it's only 2 stories. In Firestone, it's 3 stories, which was a low ray at that time. But that is the Parkdale plant on out the street from the Firestone.
Now, what did he mean when he said that we're going to take the weight off the rollers?
When they take a weight off a roller of a spinning frame or a roping frame.
Don't know.
All right, if you're using a roping frame, those rollers has to be gauged at a certain weight. If it don't, they'll make slubs in the yarn. And they don't want that. They want the yarn to be as smooth as they can produce it. In other words, if the roller is too tight coming across the bottom roller, which is steel rollers running diagonal across each other, and that toe is coming through those rollers, and if you set those rollers too heavy, you're slugging the yarn, you're putting lumps in it. They don't want that. So you have to take the weight off or add weight on, whichever way. They test the yarn after it comes through to see what breaking strength it has, and if they get the rollers set too heavy, they slubbing the yarn, making lumps in it, and if that's why the weight has to be taken off of the rollers to keep it from making lumps in the yarn. If those rollers are tightened down too tight, it will mess the yarn up. If they get the right weight on the rollers, then they get a better grade of yarn. In other words, it's more.
Would it have damaged the machinery if they hadn't taken the weight off the rollers?
Only the rollers. It would flatten the rollers if they ran them too tight. It would flatten the rubber cots on the top roller, which is rubber, or now some of them's using thin synthetic plastic. But at the time I worked in the plants, and the plants all use rubber rollers for the top roller. The bottom 2 rollers was steel, but you could flatten. That's the water tank in Gastonia, and but
just watch this now.
If they didn't use the right weight on the rollers, they could slub the yarn, which the customers didn't want yarn with slubbers in it. That's still the Parkdale plant in Gastonia on Franklin. Parkdale has increased its plant ownership from about 8 plants to 18 plants now. They bought 6 plants in Belmont in the last 2 years. So Parkdale is the biggest company in Gaston County at this time, which has changed from a Burlington-operated county to Gaston County. Parkdale is the biggest manufacturer now of textiles in Gaston County.
Tell me if you recognize this.
That particular scene looks like a scene on the Wilson Boulevard coming out of Gastonia. That does look like the Wilson Boulevard before it runs into the Wilson. It's Franklin, and that looks like scenes on the Franklin Boulevard.
Let me go back on this because I think this is at Luray Mill. Look at that building, that building in the front, and see what you think. Up, I'm sorry. Go ahead. What do you think this is?
I think that particular place there is a residential home on that street. And that particular building there is the church steeple.
You recognize this?
That is the end of the parade that took place up there at that particular time. See, that's when the crowd began to break up and stand in groups and talk it get over. And there's where they was listening to one of the speakers again. That's when they was, before the parade broke there, that particular scene is whenever the speaker was still making a lot of noise.
What did they say? When the speakers, do you remember anything?
When the speaker, he was talking particular about the conditions in the plant, and you know, he was telling the people to stick together and they wouldn't be pressed so on their jobs. And mostly he was, the speaker that I heard hollering up at the day that he was speaking when I was up there visiting, he was wanting the union to come in because the management at that time had begun to press the help. And that's what brought the union representatives into this area, because the employees began to complain about the conditions that the plant owners was putting. They was persecuting employees more than they had been in the past. In other words, that most of the time whenever plant owners and plant management presses the help, it invites a union in. And at that time, the South didn't know too much about unions, and they was against it. Personally, they was against unions, but they was needing help, so they invited the union to come in and try to organize some of the local mills, which stirred up a lot of problems and a lot of trouble, as a few people lost their lives over them inviting the unions in. But the unions were invited to Gastonia by different people, and at the time that they came to Gastonia, it didn't brew nothing but trouble, because they started killings up there at the plant, and Bill got involved, and he was communist, and that turned a lot of people against it.
That was in 29.
Yeah,
we're talking about 34.
Yeah, whenever the union was invited in, it was due to the conditions in the plant, and the people got dissatisfied because the conditions began to get harder. The millman at that time was reaching out for more profit, and he was pressing his employees to the point that they started hollering. You know, the help can only take so much, but the management and the owners, they was wanting a bigger profit off of their yarn, and their particular working conditions invited the unions in, because people got to hollering for some kind of relief, because they felt like that they had doing a honest day's work for the wages they was paying, but the millman wanted more. He began to stretch out. The stretch out system started happening along in the 30s. And some of the plants never did stretch out, but most of them did. They cut off help and loaded the next man up with his job. And it began to be where you was running 3 jobs for the price of 1. And the more that happened, the more they was inviting the unions to the South, which at that time the South didn't know anything about unions. They didn't know where to accept a union or be against it. There was only a few of the plants in Gaston County that did accept it, because they was scared of the unions. They said, oh, if a union gets in, they'll fire half of us. They'll stretch out more than the owners do. But people didn't really know what a union stood for. I think a union stands now for more to help the employees than it does the owners. In other words, a union will stand up for an employee and try to get him better working conditions, a better pay scale. And so the unions is not looked on now like they was in the 30s. Because only last year another union got in Gaston County at Freightliner. They elected a union, had a vote, and they voted them in at Freightliner, and it's only been over in Mount Holly a couple of 3 years.
I'm going to show you some more footage here.
That's still some scenes at Firestone. Scenes at Firestone Mill back during that labor dispute. That was the dispute between owners and labor. It boiled down to being just a small war between labor and management. And when I say management, I mean the owners. They had some terrible times up there at the Parkdale and Firestone during the 34s. In other words, they got down to killings. They was a few lost their lives over the working, over the strike situation and over the people congregating in big crowds like that. It caused a lot of friction because some of the employees was for the union, some of them was against it. And naturally, that caused a lot of tension and a lot of fights between the ones that was for the union and the ones that was against it.
Now, did that happen in the mill village between
That
families?
happened in front of the mill, in front of the plant itself, not particular out in the village, but at the front of the mills. That's where the labor dispute originated mostly, is in front of the plant itself. In other words, they used the mill parking lots to congregate and fight and fuss over the unions. In other words, they was divided. The people was divided. They didn't know where they wanted unions or where they was against it. Some would vote for it, some would vote against it.
Now, we have been told that when you had union and non-union people on the same street, that it created a lot of trouble between families. Could you talk about that?
Well, what I saw happen at Belmont, now this is not at Parkdale. In Belmont, it got so bad between the people that was for it and the people against it on the sidewalks, in the streets of Belmont. They threw rocks at the people. They called them scabs if they went on in the plant and worked during the strike. A person that disregarded the picket line. If you was a picket and I wanted to work and I went on in there and done my job, and you out there in front of the plant trying to keep people out, and I ignored you and went on in, that caused hard feelings between what they called, now this was the people that was on the picket lines, was against the employees that was inside working, which was, you know, the minority was working and the majority was in the streets fighting it, because they felt like that they'd never get better working conditions if they didn't picket against that particular plant. And they called every employee that worked during that time a scab. That was what they named the people that had ignored the picket lines.
Now, were you ever a member of the union?
No, sir.
Could you just say, I was never a member?
I was never a member of the union because when I started employment with the textiles, the union never was mentioned again at the plant I worked in. Never mentioned again after that strike. In other words, I never had an opportunity to join a union because after I grew into manhood and older and a lot of years experience in a textile plant, I would have joined the union. That was after they changed superintendents, because the new superintendent stretched out on us. He put more work on us for the same pay. And I would have later joined the union, but at the time that union was trying to organize the South, I didn't never have an opportunity to join. I was never approached with a plea to join or a plea not to. I didn't have an opportunity to ever belong to a union.
Now, did you recall any propaganda against the unions?
Sure I do.
Tell us about that.
The propaganda that was going mostly was if a union got elected and got control of the plants, that to help the employees themselves wouldn't have any privileges at all. They would have to work 8 hours without a break, and they was just all kind of lies told on the union that they would take all their privileges away from them, make them stay at the machines 8 hours. They wouldn't get to take 15-minute or 10-minute breaks or whatever the company originally allowed. They was propaganda going around that the union didn't allow nothing, you know, that they was so hard boiled that they made you work 8 hours because they felt like you was drawing 8 hours pay. And you didn't get breaks according to the propaganda, but that wasn't the way it was.
What about dues? What about the union dues?
Well, at the time they was trying to organize Gaston County, the union dues wasn't all that high, but you know, the better paying job you got, the higher your union dues are. But at the time they was organizing the local plants, the union dues, I believe, was around $6 or $7. But later I heard they got up as high as $15 and $16 a week. But they claim to start off with the union, the dues joining the union was small considering what they are now if you belong to a union.
Okay. I'll get it back again, Jamie. Cut it just a little, Jimmy. Where is the, we've heard from some of the textile workers that they came and organized the union, and then the guys who organized ran off with the dues, and they never heard any more about it. Do you recall hearing that?
Well, I've heard that some of the office workers did take some of the union dues and skip, but the rumors that was printed in our local paper said they caught them, and they had to replace as much of the union money as they could, but some of them went to prison because they called it embezzling or defrauding the company at a union. And there was a few local people went to prison over trying to steal union funds, but there was some of them that completely never repaid the union for money. They take it out of the office, where the money was, where they accumulated the money when they deducted it from your payroll. But there was a lot of people fled Gaston County to keep from getting prosecuted over defraud and embezzling the union.
Now, when people who were in the union and they went on strike and they were living in mill houses, what happened to them?
Well, if a union didn't win the elections after they took an active part in trying to get a union in, at that particular time they didn't have laws to prevent it, and a lot of times they would lose their jobs by owners. In other words, the owners would give management orders to replace that particular employee if they took too active a part in the union, and that's why a lot of employers were scared to join a union. They were scared the plant owner would fire them or have them fired. And a lot of people wouldn't join for that simple reason, and that made it hard for a union to get in these plants. The South has never accepted a union wholeheartedly. Even today, as many plants as the textile industry has in the South, 95% of them will not accept a union. I'd say in Gaston, North Carolina, there's only 5% of the plants organized and have work under union rules. Now, you take in Belmont alone, there's 28 textile plants, and there's only 2 of them union. That's a small percentage in Belmont.
Yeah, I'm going to show you a little bit more of this footage. It's all silent stuff. See if you recognize anything. If you do, just turn and tell me about it.
Well, that congregation of employees and people is still at the Low-Ray plant in Gastonia. In other words, that particular group of people are still milling around in front of the Parkdale plant on Franklin. And that is one of the water tanks at one of the Parkdale plants out at the end of the plant. You can see them when you ride Franklin Boulevard. You can see all the water tanks, and most of them has their names engraved in big letters on the water tank, so you'll know what particular company that owns that particular plant, because there's so many plants in Gastonia that every one of them tries to put their names on the water tank so that visitors and travelers can recognize who owns each individual plant.
Now watch this again and see if you can recognize anybody. I'll stop. Tell me if you want me to stop anytime.
I still don't recognize the people because they was older people and I was only a young boy. So people at the age those people that's in that parade I just don't recognize them because I was a kid. I wasn't interested in that parade. I was watching those troops around that plant because I didn't know when they was going to use those guns. See, I was curious because I was a young boy, but I didn't recognize any of the people that was taking active part in the parade. I wished I could help you some on identifying some of the paraders, but you know, it's like I said, I just knowed it was a crowd.
Have you turned the sound on?
No, the,
Back to the Parkdale.
do you remember the big Labor Day meetings here?
Yes, sir.
That's at a big Labor Day rally. There's the Parkdale Mill again.
Yeah, and at the time that they was having those textile gatherings, those crowds would get huge.
Yeah.
In other words, people would go from everywhere to see what was taking place because most people realized it was dangerous because there could always be trouble because there was two factions, the pro and the cons. People for the Union and the people against the Union, and they was all milling together in those congregations.
See if you can, I think this is New England. Yeah, that's New England, so I'm gonna just race ahead.
Woody, they had Labor Day celebrations each year?
Yeah.
They did observe Labor Day.
Far Yarns puts it on bigger than most all companies. They have a big fire display, and they have a dinner over there. And you know, if you buy tickets for about a quarter, well, you can attend their big Labor Day celebrations because it goes on 8 hours or 10 hours a day when they have big Labor Day celebrations.
Here's some more people. Yep, sorry, I'm gonna go back on that. Sorry, Jamie. Reminds you of things.
Well, most of the people that's in that parade are wearing cotton-made clothes. In other words, their shirts and their pants. People couldn't afford dress clothes under the wages they were making back then. They had to wear cotton. Well, cotton was the cheapest material that was made, and it was good material.
But you notice these girls are all dressed up.
You call it dressed up, but they was still got cotton garments. See, a lot of those men are overalls, some of them pants and shirts. But 90% of the people couldn't afford a suit of clothes, not on cotton mill wages. And there's where they began to carry the signs, you know, telling which side they was on and whether they was pro or con for the unions. But later, after all the trouble died down, then the textile people got back together and began to get along better because they didn't hold the union against the pros or the cons. In other words, people began to live then again like a big family, like they did before the union was ever invited to the South. And working conditions alone caused the union to try to organize the southern textile plants.
See if you recognize any of this. Now let's back again to the lady so we can go ahead on this.
That was a Labor Day celebration when people was more happier. See how they throwing up their hands and waving. You know, they wasn't. Of course, they still had police protection directing them to keep moving. You know, to keep them blocking the traffic and first one thing and another. But that was more or less a Labor Day celebration there than it was a union meeting.
Cut it, Jamie. I want to get up to another.
There that the people got so involved. Well, they began to holler they wanted peace between the workers and the union because the thing had got out of hand. While the government.
Start and say that again, because we want to be close on you when we say that. So just look at me and say that the same thing again.
The textile workers and the union, it got so ripped up, it got dangerous, so the people got to holler and they wanted peace between the pros and the cons. In other words, the people that was for the union and the people that was against the unions, they got to holler and they wanted peace between each faction because they was scared there was going to be a civilized war in Gastonia at that time because it done got dangerous up there because, you know, people were fighting each other with their fists and using clubs and the people got so fed up with it over a period of weeks, they began to holler peace and they went to printing it on big signs, hold them up over their heads, we want peace, we want peace. Well, it was peace between the pros and the cons that wanted unions and didn't want unions. The people that rejected the union was the ones that hollered first that they wanted peace because they was getting a bad end of it. In other words, the cons on it was, at that time, they was kind of, the pros was a little bit stronger at that particular point of textiles life than it was later, which they had to come back together and work as a family. You know, work as one big family. Whether they wanted to or not, the textile workers did get back to where they could get along with their fellow workers and not be mad at him because he was pro-union or against the union. And but I think the employees brought the trouble on themselves with the way they acted at the meetings, you know, because some of them just went wild. In other words, they didn't go for peace, they went for trouble. They went to stir up trouble to keep the union from establishing.
Now, how did they stir up trouble? Did they have spies in the mill, or did?
Well, I think each side did. I think both sides tried to work undercover against the other side to find out just exactly when the meetings was going to be held and when they was going to meet again, and they would try to disrupt those meetings to keep people afraid to attend, afraid they would get bodily hurt, you know. I think you got a point. I think that both sides had people working undercover to try to disclose each side's future plans at the next meeting. And they would have them meetings every several days apart. You know, they would tell the crowd when the next meeting would be, but some of them would try to get inside information that they was going to try to find out even where the second meeting was going to be after this one that's coming up. And I think it was a lot of undercover stuff took place on both sides.
Now,
and it turned a lot of people against the union by the way that they acted up there in Gastonia. A lot of people got scared of the union for that simple reason.
Now, could you tell me, you were 15, 16 years, 17 years, 16
Right.
years old.
Right.
You were reading the newspapers. Do you recall anything on the radio about all this?
Well, not too much radio, because at that particular time we didn't have a radio. We couldn't afford one. And we later got one, but we didn't have a radio, so we had to go by the daily newspaper and mostly gossip for the public. You know, you could hear all kind of rumors concerning the unions and textile employees and what this and said and what that and said. And it was just an unrestful time. You know, people they was upset because they didn't know what was coming next, because the governor called out the troops against them, and the people didn't know what was going to happen, whether it was going to be a shooting war or whether they was going to have a job after it was all over. But they survived it. The people.